What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 750. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, you ready to talk a little cube?
Always, you know it.
I know. We were deciding what to talk about on the show this week, and we both had the same idea at the same time. Like, hey, we should do our vintage cube set review. We've been going color by color, and this week we're going to be talking about green. Before we do, though, we want to say thank you to each and every one of our patrons over on patreon.com/limited resources. That's the place where you can go to support your favorite content creators, including us, if we happen to be one of them. But even if we're not, there's plenty of, again, most of your favorite content creators will have a Patreon page, and it's really great. It's something that didn't exist when we first started doing the podcast all those years ago. And, it's really become kind of the foundation for, I think, a lot of content creators. It allows you to directly support them, and you even get some cool perks like in ours. No matter what level you're at, you get a thank you card and a sticker in the mail, as well as access to the Patreon feed where you can ask questions like our Patreon question of the week, which we're going to answer in just a minute. But again, thank you to everybody on Patreon. Really do support it. We really do appreciate it. And also, we want to say thank you to Ultimate Guard. They also are sponsors of the show. And, when we needed a sponsor, we went to them to ask because they make the best stuff in the business. It's very easy to get behind products like this. If you've ever held a deck box or tried out the katana sleeves or whichever sleeves you prefer from Ultimate Guard, you'll find that they are top quality, really well made. They feel really good in the hand. They're sturdy and they last a long time. And that's true of their entire product line. We highly recommend that you check them out if you need any of that kind of stuff for taking care of your collection, your decks, even individual cards. You can find it at ultimateguard.com, and then you can go to your favorite local game store or your favorite online retailer to actually buy it. I mentioned the Patreon question of the week. We like to answer one question from our patrons per week. This one comes from Nate, who says, in Vintage Cube, most of the normal draft heuristics go out the window. Cabs, creature count, etc. Cards that would be unbeatable bombs in normal draft sets can be just average. I recognize that a big part of success is just knowing the cards and the archetypes. But for cubes and high-powered, flat-powered draft environments in general, do you have any useful heuristics that you would follow if you're coming into it fresh without knowing the cards and the archetypes?
I think one thing you can do pretty easily is look up like a top 50 list. I've put it a couple on Twitter. I made a video about them, for example, and it's less do you know every single card in the top 50, or does this card 47th or 23rd, and more like, okay, I know all the pieces of power are good. Moxes, Lotus, Ancestral, Time Walk, Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, all that. Mm-hmm. But it's also like, Minsk and Boo's a busted card. Orcish Bowmasters is really, really good. Broadside Bombardier is a relatively recent addition. I have really high up. Fable the Mirror Breaker. I think in terms of heuristics, it can be tricky because there's cards that are very strong in cube that might not have made like massive constructed waves, or like a card like Parallax Wave, I think is a very strong cube card. But unless you've been playing a million years ago, you wouldn't have really known about that card. It's not like a card people talk about even outside the context of cube that much anymore.
Right.
But a card like Fable the Mirror Breaker, Orcish Bowmasters, the One Ring, I would say most people who pay some attention to competitive play kind of realize how good these cards are. Fable's been banned in a bunch of formats and won the last 3 Pro Tours. Yeah, it's not a big stretch to think that might be a good card. I think just familiarizing yourself with those. And another heuristic that really changes the most is how good mana fixing is. Mm-hmm. Fetch lands are cards I frequently first pick. Cards like Triomes and dual lands, like, Underground Sea, Volcanic Island, that sort of thing are early-ish picks. The Surveil lands are good. Unlike in normal limited, your goal in cube is to have at least 4 or 5 non-basics among your mana base. It's going to be hard to make a 2-color deck that functions as well as you want it to without doing that. Because it's not to say that you can't win a cube draft with blue-white control playing 9/8 islands and plains, but you're just going to lose an extra game, maybe 2, maybe more over the course of a draft, whereas your opponents aren't often going to stumble like that. I like to try to minimize the places I can just straight up lose games, and drawing, Counterspell and Vendilion Click with Plains Island is just definitely a way to lose those games. So I guess cubes is not really a good way to shortcut it, but getting to know what the top 50-ish cards are at least gives you an idea of which cards, like if you see, you should be like, oh, that's a good sign, I should take that. And B, it gives you a little bit of information about cube structure as a whole. When a card like Bowmasters or Hole Breacher is a high pick, it's like, okay, yeah, there's a lot of people drawing extra cards in this format. That's the sort of thing that you can kind of pay attention to.
Yeah, for me, if I'm doing a cube that I haven't drafted before, there are certain base level assumptions like Luis outlined, and I'll stick to those, the same that he said. The other two things that I focus on are, one, another one that Luis said, which is lands/mana fixing. You just don't have to settle for bad mana bases in most cubes. You kind of do in limited. We've talked about it a lot where, you just don't get a lot of duels in regular limited, and we're kind of resigned to 9/8 mana bases, but as Luis has pointed out many, many times on the show, those aren't good. Like, those aren't the numbers that you'd actually want to see for a consistent, smooth experience. There's also extra pressure on your mana base. Even if you're only playing 2 cards, many of the cards have double mana symbol, double colors in their mana symbols because they're the most powerful cards ever, and many of those cost blue, red, etc. So you really need to make sure that you're aware of your mana. And the other reason for that is because if you look at an average cube draft, especially a powered cube or something like that, when you get to the end, you're going to have some number of cards. You take 45 cards ish, and you're only going to be playing 23 of them. And, that means you're going to have 10, 12 cards that you don't actually play in your deck. And those are all going to be good, playable, reasonable cards that you're not going to play. And that means that when you took them, you were like, all right, this is good. This is in my colors. And yet it didn't make the cut. If any of those could have been a land, you're basically getting that for free. And you should prioritize lands accordingly. The other thing that I look for are, I guess you could call them like signpost cards. Most people that build cubes, that are the actual builder of the cube itself, they will have archetypes in mind for some color pairs. A lot of cube cards are based on raw power. They're just good. You cast them, they affect the game in a positive way, and they're really good. Those ones you don't have to worry about. Most of the time, if you're familiar with the cards that people put into cubes, you'll understand the relative power level of those cards. But there are some that are more narrow that lead you down a path of an archetype playing a certain way. And if you see a card like that kind of stands out, oh, that isn't always in the cube, or, oh, that card, okay, I know when I see that card, I'm supposed to do this, that I would trust the person who built the cube, that they have supported it, that card isn't just floating out there in the ether, hoping that somebody takes it and does something interesting. Most of the time, you'll find that the person had a specific reason to put that card in the cube, and therefore, you should assume that those reasons are in there. And that can come in 2 forms. One of them is that there's an archetype that it goes around, and the other form is that there's a companion card that goes with it. Sometimes there's 2 card combos. If you see Voltaic Key in a cube, you're not thinking like, oh, I'm just going to untap my creature and now it has vigilance, my artifact guy or whatever, right? You're thinking of Time Vault, or at least, one of the mana rocks or whatever.
I got to stop you there, because that historically has been true, but manifold keys in the current cube and there's no Time Vault. So yeah, it actually is just straight up untapping.
That is true. Right, and
I got a better example, or a couple.
Okay.
I can think of so many better examples in Marshall, actually.
Okay. Can you just give them to us?
If you see Flash, you should just probably first pick it. It's a very good card, and there are all the cards you would expect. World Spine Worm, Atali, that Vault-Born Tyrant's a new one, that sort of thing. If you see Tinker, you can assume that Portal to Phyrexia, Bolsa Citadel, some big creatures are into. So I think that, yes, generally, if you see one of those kinds of cards, I would just pick it if it's like, that those tend to be on the more powerful side. I would pick it and assume the support is there, because if not, then you're playing a weird cube experience, one way or the other.
Exactly. And, I like to just and look, if I find out later that the cube designer has left me hanging, I'll be like, hey, why
you have complaint equity.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you're getting some out of it no matter what. Great question, Nate. Thanks for that. And of course, apropos to what we're talking about here today. And speaking of that, we're going to do our Crack-a-Pack, and it is also going to be vintage cube. So let's get right into it. First card out. Ah, man, perfect example for what we were just talking about, Luis. It's Sword of the Meek. right?
Right.
If you open up that card, you're like, okay, Thopter Foundry is going to be in here. I don't have to just think, oh, I'm meant to just
arranged to have Sword of the Meek in your cube and not have a Thopter Foundry in the cube.
Yeah, if that's the case, I'm never drafting your cube again. Like what are you doing? I mean, I guess the one exception would be is if you used to have it and took one out but forgot to take the other. But if you purposely just have Sword of the Meek in there, like you're a troll, and I don't want to draft your cube anymore. But what about Sword of the Meek as a 2-card combo? I've really loved having it in the Vintage Cube because it's powerful, but not broken to the point that the game just ends on the spot.
Right. If they kill the Thopter Foundry, even after like one turn or even 2 turns in some cases, the game still goes on. Or I've even had games where someone kills the Thopter Foundry a few turns after, and obviously the Thopter Foundry person has made like tons of tokens, but then has a sweeper. Like if you go like, unexpectedly absent for 5, untap Wrath of God, like, yeah, maybe they've gained a bunch of life and you've taken a bunch of damage. You get to play the game. It's also the sort of thing that works really well in an artifact shell, and like Thopter Foundry can have some games where it's okay. I tend not to first pick either of these pieces. The ideal scenario for me is like around in like an 8-player pod, 6th or 7th, picking one up, or maybe a little sooner if it's weak, because then you get to kind of have this like free roll where if you get a combo, the other combo piece later, you end up with a pretty strong combo. It also does require a little more work, like just because you see both cards. Like I've had decks with both cards in the sideboard, because if you don't have any card draw or tutors, you don't have any artifact synergies, like you could just not play the cards. It's not like you have to play these 2 cards. So I would typically not first pick either half.
Same. But yeah, but I wish there were a few more combos like this that hit that powerful but not busted range. Because also Sword of the Meek, it really doesn't do much on its own. Thopter Foundry, as you mentioned, it can actually do a few things. I mean, even if they blow it up, you could sacrifice it to itself and get a flyer out of the deal. And like, you feel like you got something going. If you just play Sword of the Meek, it really doesn't do that much, as an equipment. But anyway, that's one that I would earmark, but not take here. Next is Territorial Kavu. That's the green-red star. And this thing's really cool. The power and toughness are each equal to your, what is it called again? Domain, thank you.
Land types, the number of land types you have.
Your land types in play. And when it attacks, you can choose one of 2 triggered abilities. You can discard a card, and then if you do, draw a card. You don't have to, though. And you can exile a single card from a graveyard.
I really like the domain package. So that's like Territorial Kavu, Scion of Draco, Neshoba Brawler, Tribal Flames, Leyline Binding, and
they have Prismatic Omen and stuff.
Prismatic Omen, I don't is not in this cube, and I don't have it in mine either. It's just a little too weak. Prismatic Ending. No, which one are you talking about?
The one in a green makes all your.
Yeah, that one is typically in with Valakut and Dryad of the Elysian Grove, but it has been cut the last couple iterations. Though I think it's you could have that in if you wanted. But I like the domain package because it rewards you for doing something I already do, which is draft fetch lands and duels and triomes highly, and it's really fun. Like it's fun to like figure out the mana base. Tron is when you have a triome, like let's say Zagoth triome alongside Plateau. So turn 2, you have all 5 land types.
Yeah,
and the natural 20. Turn 1, you just fetch your triumph. Turn 2, you play your duel, play your Scion. Turn 3, you cast Broadside Bombardiers, attack them for 6, fling it for 14. That's the
okay.
I've not quite gotten that, even though I've had all those cards in the same deck. I would not also take Territorial Kavu early. This is a card I'm looking to wield to see if Domain's open, because one of the cool things I like about it is because Domain, by virtue of requiring all the different land types, can fit into kind of any shell. I've had decks that like I thought I was blue-white, but then I had a Scalding Tarn and a Wooded Foothills, and I had a Triome, and then I got a couple duels, and it's like, oh, my mana actually works to put Scion and Territorial Kavu in my deck and a Leyline Binding, and like this adds this really cool aspect. So I like cube cards that reward you for drafting certain ways that are also not like first picks. Like one of the rewards for drafting a domain mana base is you will frequently get a Neshoba Brawler or a Territorial Kavu with 4 or 5 cards left in the pack because not that many people at the table want them. I would say after extensive experience cubing, not like Territorial Kavu is one of those cards where I think when it gets opened in a draft, it probably gets put in a deck like in between 50 and 70% of the time, probably closer to 50. Whereas like, a card like Ponder is about 100% of the time, 95% of the time. Like it's hard for that not to end up in a deck. Whereas like Ancestral Recall or Time Walk is basically 100%. Scalding Tarn is 100%. Right. And then there's cards like Limb Duel's Vault or Sword of the Meek, which are like maybe sub 50%. Like I bet Sword of the Meek and Thopter French are about a quarter of the time, maybe 20% of the time they get played, which is about the low end. I wouldn't want cards that are too much lower, but it's cool having cards that don't always get played. I actually think Eureka and Show and Tell are great additions to Q, both the Druids, even though those get played maybe a quarter or less of the time. That's fine because the time they do get played, they're like integral to a deck and really fun. Where you don't want to land is a card that doesn't get played much, but is also weak when it does get played. Like that is kind of a failure case. And I think Territorial Kavu is firmly in the doesn't always get played, is pretty good when it gets played, gives you something to draft towards. Really cool card, not the pick though.
Yeah, there's another card in this pack that fits that description too. I'll talk about it when we get there. Next up is Phyrexian Fleshgorger. That's the 7 mana, 7/5 menace lifelink with ward, pay life equal to its power. But you can prototype it for 1 black, and it's a 3/3 with all that stuff.
I think this card is actually in the category we just talked about of pretty weak. And when it gets played, it's not that important to your deck. Agreed. So I wouldn't take it, and I would just cut it from the cube.
Yeah, I would too. It's interesting because in prior iterations of Cube, a big lifelinker like this had a little bit more oomph to it because the mono red decks were like actually a thing. And so you wanted these for like sideboards or for people to hedge against it. Cards like Batterskull and stuff serve that type of purpose. But that isn't really a thing these days, and you need your expensive either reanimator or, put it into play for cheap type targets to really do something right away. And this just kind of sits there and is annoying. But, if you put a bunch of resources into getting a Fleshgorger into play and then you just say go, like you're kind of asking for it. And this next card's one of the reasons why it's Lauren of the Third Path. That's 2 and a white for a 2/1 vigilance. And when it ETBs, you can blow up an artifact or enchantment. And then interestingly, you can tap it to have you and your opponent each draw a card.
Yeah, that extra line of text is a bit of a throwaway, but I think it's kind of cool. It's a Mondo combo with like Hull Breacher or Narset. Yep. When you're losing, it can be good. But overall, Lauren is just a very solid card. I would hope not to take a Lauren in the first like 3 or 4 picks, but if you're already solidly mono white, then Lauren's a great pickup, and it's got some little mini combos also with like Caracas, for example.
Right. And, artifacts are a huge deal in Vintage Cube. Enchantments are to a lesser extent, but still they matter a lot too. So that's why Lauren is so good, is that it is, what percentage of the time do you say Lauren of the Third Path is a 2-for-1, even if you just decide to cast it on curve? It's a lot.
Yeah, I would say it's almost always like, because you don't have to you usually don't have to run it out without a target, and there's so many targets. Basically every single deck has targets, and picking up a talisman and then blocking is totally fine.
Next is Spirebluff Canal. Makes blue or red mana, but it is not an actual duel in the sense that it's just a land. It's not an island. It's one of the things that has come about in the recent years for the Vintage Cube and Magic in general probably is that they've gotten a little bit more generous, and we've had more time to have lands that have the basic land types on them, similar to the shock lands, which kind of the shock lands and dual lands kind of occupied that space. But once they started putting it on a few more, now all of a sudden those become fetchable, which is a huge benefit that a card like Spirebluff Canal does not have. And I feel like while these cards still see plenty of play, they've taken the backseat to Triumphs and those type of cards pretty hard.
Definitely. I have like the fast land cycle is not the worst or weakest. Everyone deserves its spot at this point, but it's close to the bottom of all the lands, with the like Fiery Islet type lands, I think, being slightly worse. But certainly these are worse than Triumphs, Duels, Fetches, Surveil lands, any of those. Anything that has types is going to be better. Not even just for domain cards, also just for things like Fetch lands or Nature's Lore or whatever. Right. So I would, Spirebluff's one of the better ones, but I still wouldn't want to take this card early.
Next up is a pet card of mine. It's Renin 6. This is green-red for a 3 loyalty planeswalker. You can plus it to return a land from your graveyard to your hand. You can -1 it, +1 it, I should have said, -1 it to do 1 damage to any target. And you can -7 to get an emblem that says instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard have a retrace, which means you can cast them from there with the additional cost of discarding a land.
I like Renin 6 quite a bit. I just don't want to take it without having cards that already work with it. Like Strip Mine is like the most appealing of these, but cards like fetch lands, to some degree like Fiery Islet or cycling lands are okay. But overall, I think Renin 6 is a good card that once you have combos, but is not a card I'm just taking early.
Yeah, with how fast the cube is now, and many creatures die to Renin 6 as well. So, if somebody casts, a Noble Hierarch, or, if you're really living the dream, a Ragavan or something like that, and you go Renin 6, kill it, like it feels like your win percentage just spiked upwards when you do that, because the Renin 6 gets to sit on the battlefield, and if it ever gets back a land or kills another thing or prevents your opponent from casting their next, 1-drop or whatever, it just does so much work. And the ultimate is a long way off. It doesn't come up very often, but you can definitely start marching Renin 6 upwards. You don't actually need a target for the land, so you can just go plus. And, it does at some point usually become something that the opponent has to go, okay, I got to throw something at that Renin 6 because the ultimate is actually somewhat powerful. But really, it's more about the first 2 abilities and the fact that Renin 6 only costs 2 mana. Next, pretty darn good card, Intrepid Adversary. I got to give it its props. It's 1 and a white, 3/1 lifelink, and when it ETBs, you can pay 1 and a white any number of times, and for each time you do, it gets what are they? Valor counters on it.
Yeah, and then all your creatures have +1/+1 for each Valor counter on it, including itself.
Right. So they effectively are +1/+1 counters on it and everything else that you have. This to me looks at face value like just kind of a throwaway 2-drop for white. And look, many of these white 2-drop aggressive creatures are interchangeable, but Intrepid Adversary does have the real benefit of coming down a little bit later in the game and making a very real impact the turn that it hits the board, where many of the white 2-drops don't. Many of them are like very difficult to kill 2-mana 3/1s or whatever. And those are good. They hold their own too, but Adversary, you flood a little bit or you get a mock straw or something and you kick it once or twice, and all of a sudden your board is way different than it was before the Adversary hit. And then also the fact that it just has random lifelink can really matter in the right matchup too. Look, I'm not super high on it. It's still a white 2-drop that does that type of thing, but of them, this one's pretty dang good.
Yeah, I think it's totally fine. I would not be considering it quite this early in the pack, but I agree that it's a strong card.
I'm like a total Strip Mine junkie. So at this point, I'm just thinking of Renin 6 and come on, baby, somebody, open me up a Strip Mine. But we've got a lot more pack to go here. Next is Brazen Borrower. That's the 1 blue 3/1 flash flyer that can only block creatures with flying, but it's also Petty Theft on the adventure side, which is a 1 and a blue instant that says return target non-land permanent that an opponent controls to its owner's hand.
Yeah, I have gone up quite a bit on Brazen Borrower. I now think it's pretty close to a premium card. It just has a really good effect on the game. You get to bounce anything you want. It covers all your bases. They tinkered something early, or they cheated a big thing into play, or they just went Dark Ritual Sneak Attack on turn 2 but didn't have the mana to activate it. All that stuff, yes, as well as just bouncing a creature. And then also you get to cast a 3/1, which is pretty good. These formats, Cube's fast. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of creatures, and I think that this card works very nicely with a lot of different things. I would hope to take this around 5th pick, usually, not first pick, but it is a good card.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I love these flexible cards. The next one is the one I was talking about earlier, and I'm really curious to hear where your take is on this card, Luis, because to me, it is kind of in that danger zone of doesn't quite get played often enough, maybe to earn its seat, but when it does, it's really interesting and cool, and it's High Tide. It's a blue instant that says, until end of turn, whenever a player taps an island for mana, it adds an additional blue. Mostly exclusively a storm card, and it's one I would say that's got to be on the low end of percent time it gets drafted actually makes the deck. But when it does, it's really cool.
Yeah, High Tide is sweet. It broke my heart to cut it from my cube. I like that it's in this cube, but I think that it probably gets put in a deck. Like, I would be surprised if it was more than 10%. I think it's likely to be less than 10%.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
And that I think is not what I'd be looking at. That's why I cut it from my cube. As much as I personally love it, it just doesn't function quite enough. And that's a big strike against it. It is cool though.
It is cool. Next is actually not that cool. It's Winds of Abandon. That's the 1 and a white sorcery, exile a creature you don't control. And if that happens, then they get to search up a basic land and put it on the battlefield tap. But it has Overload for 4 white, where it happens to each creature that your opponent controls. This card, I always find it too mediocre on the front end. The 1 and a white sorcery to kill something is like, But man, if your deck can make some mana, this is one of the few cards in the cube that can actually like swing a game that you're really behind on. So maybe you just take the hit on the front end. Where are you at on Winds of Abandon?
Oh, I think it's a really good card. Okay. I think that Winds of Abandon is likely one of the best white cards, like outside of the top 10 or so.
Okay.
Where you want to put it is an aggressive deck where you get to basically cast it for 6 mana and either kill them that turn or the next turn, but hopefully that turn, so they don't even get to use all the things that all the lands they get. And it's the kind of card that it's like Parallax Wave in that if I were to show you a game and say, hey, you actually lost this game, you'd be like, how did I lose this game? Winds of Abandon is often the culprit. It's like you're playing red-white against your green opponent, and they have 7 creatures in play, and you have 4 creatures in play, and all of a sudden they have 10 lands in play, and they're dead.
Right.
So I don't want to take it this early, but I think that like it wouldn't be crazy to take Winds early, and it is, I think, better than Adversary early on.
Okay. Yeah, I think I like taking Adversary above it. The issue I have with it is that like it is difficult to get 6 mana for the white deck. It's not like that just happens every single time. Sometimes you pick up, some acceleration that'll help you out. And you're right, it does win you the game when you do it in many scenarios, especially shockingly so, right? Where it's like, oh my God, how did you win that game? And it ends up being this quite often. But I mean, I don't know, my white deck, I'm not really planning on having it get to 6 mana that often.
Well, that's the thing is that you don't need to get to 6 to have it be something that's pretty good. It can work just fine
at 2.
At 2, when they tinker or cheat something out early, or you just remove their 4-drop.
That is true. And that is a big inflection point in the cube. Next is Deep Cavern Bat. That's the 1 and a black 1/1 flying lifelink, and when it ETBs, you get to take a card from your opponent's hand until the bat leaves the battlefield.
Honestly, this is the best card we've seen. I think Deep Cavern Bat is actually a legit great card. Like I would probably be taking Deep Cavern Bat right now if I didn't have any other options.
Over Brazen Borrower, huh?
I think that they're both good. I think Deep Cavern Bat's really good. And
that's crazy. I like that.
It's just great. It's great in, first of all, it's great in Lurrus decks, which I love. I always I either try to be open for Lurrus or Academy when one of those 2 cards come, but I think that it's great in those decks. It's great in like an aggressive red-black deck or a Reanimator deck or a blue-black deck. It's really good with Fallen Shinobi. Like there's a lot you can do.
Yeah, for sure. It does overperform. Speaking of overperform, I need to know where this card's currently at in the power rankings, and it's very high up there. It's Mana Crypt, 0 mana artifact, and taps to add 2 mana to your mana pool for 0. Like this is Soul Ring that's free. You don't even have to pay the 1 mana up front. Now it does come though with a major downside. Like this is affects the game, matters almost every time downside, which is at the beginning of your upkeep, you flip a coin. And if you lose the flip, the crypt hits you for 3.
So I think Mana Crypt is, if not in the top like 3 or 4 cards, could be potentially the best card. Like
it's the most busted of all the fast mana, right?
Yeah, because you get 0 mana, up front. So it's only 1 better than Soul Ring. I personally think Soul Ring's better.
Okay.
Because I think that paying that 1 and making it so that you don't end up dying to mana crypt flips, which is like a real thing,
It happens
is better.
a lot.
But I think there's some people I know who I drafted, like J-Bro, for example. He has mana crypt above Sol Ring. He you know, speaking of drafting like you have a card, he drafts all his decks like he's got a mana crypt. So when he does get that mana crypt, ooh, you got to watch out. You know, turn one Reckless Stormseeker, you know, turn two Rampaging Raptor or Ulvenwald Oddity, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And
is Lotus the only comp for mana crypt as far as like bustedness of the fast mana?
Lotus, Sol Ring, and Time Walk are in the same tier as Mana Crypt, I believe. Like
I meant as far as like fast mana goes, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, technically Mana Vault gives you the same amount as Mana Crypt in the same turn, but obviously Mana Crypt's so much better because you just get to tap it again the next turn.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, we're going to take Mana Crypt out of this pack, barring one of those other cards showing up.
Right.
And you do have to draft the deck around it. There are decks, like I've had decks in pack 3 that opened Mana Crypt in a Mox and took the Mox. Actually, literally saw BK do that yesterday because the deck had a bunch of 2 mana plays. It wasn't trying to get the game over with. It didn't have early, you know, proactive threats. And Mana Crypt really does want you to do all those things because you eventually do lose 2 Mana Crypt if you don't do anything. Like I've seen that happen.
That happens a lot. Yeah. Yeah. I think that, you know, it's interesting because it used to be there wasn't much debate about Mana Crypt versus Sol Ring. Sol Ring was definitely considered above Mana Crypt just because you do die to the flips, you know, often enough. But as the speed of the cube has increased and as the 3-drops have become such a clear inflection point for Vintage Cube, it does feel like Mana Crypt has either tied or in some decks, you know, gone past it because it is more broken, right? Like Mana Crypt is just, you can play a 3-drop on turn 1 with no extra help outside of the crypt and a land. And, you know, if you just take a quick browse at some of the things that you can do, and we've talked about them in our previous set reviews for the Vintage Cube as well. I mean, some of those cards give you a huge advantage and a quick clock, and the game can end really, really quickly from there, where before, you know, it felt like there was a number of decks that really wanted to do things that cost 6 or more mana. And of course, Mana Crypt's good at there too, but there you're definitely exposing yourself to that 1.5 damage per turn on average that starts to get you. But if you can close out the game with a powerful 3-drop into a powerful 4-drop, which again, to me, that represents the real meat of the Vintage Cube, the power cards, the payoffs, the things that you go, okay, I got to deal with that, come in at 3 and 4 now. And Mana Crypt just lets you do that on turn 1 and 2. It is going to have, it's going to, I mean, I believe that as the cube gets faster and faster, that distance will start to form between Mana Crypt and Sol Ring. And I think Mana Crypt will be the winner out of the deal.
Yeah, and you know, I think that any game you start with a Mana Crypt, any game you start with it, you'll be happy. But any draft you start with it, you'll also be pretty thrilled, I think.
Next up is Karn, Scion of Urza. This is the 4 mana Karn with 5 loyalty, and you can +1 to reveal the top 2 cards of your library, and your opponent gets to pick one that goes in your hand and one that goes into exile with a silver counter on it, and you can -2 it to make a construct, if you will, +1/+1 for each artifact you control. And you can -1 it to grab one of the cards with a silver counter on it and put it in your hand. Basically, it's +1 draw land, -2 make a 4/4 in this cube. Like, yeah, I mean, the best use of it is when people go play it, minus it in my mind. Like,
yeah, that's definitely the best. I think Karn is fine. I view it as an artifact payoff that if you've gotten enough artifacts, you know, you can put Karn in your deck and it can do something, but it's not a card I'm like super thrilled about.
Similar to the Territorial Kavu, we have Leyline Binding here, the 5 and a white enchantment with flash and domain. It costs 1 less to cast for each land type you have. And when it enters the battlefield, you exile a non-land permanent opponent controls, and that stays exiled as long as Leyline Binding is around.
I think that this card is a great card for all the reasons I said about Territorial Kavu. It's actually a little bit better because it only costs 1 colored mana, and it fits in like control decks and aggro decks alike. But not only was it not competitive with Mana Crypt, I really rarely take this card in the first 5 or 6 picks. Like I have to have a lot more information. Maybe in a later pack, I could see doing something like that, but certainly not, right at this point in time.
Yeah, this definitely has payoff vibes. Last is Ornery Tumblewag, new card. So that's the 2 and a green 2/2, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And whenever the Tumblewag attacks while saddled, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature, and its saddle cost is 2.
I tried this one. I didn't think it was good enough. I still don't. It's fine. It's just it doesn't give you quite enough meat for how much it costs and what it's offering.
Yeah, that it seems to be a 1 mana off of what you would expect. So super easy mana crypt here. If we take the mana crypt out, are you sticking to the Deep Cavern Bat pick, or what do you like?
I guess I would probably take Deep Cavern Bat. I could see taking Brazen Borrower. I think those are both pretty good, but I would be very much not thrilled. The person who gets this pack second or third is going to be pretty annoyed. Then by fifth or sixth pick, that's about when you should be taking a lot of these cards, so it's not so bad for those people. But the first couple of people after the Mana Crypt are going to be pretty unhappy.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would be looking at Brazen Borrower for my pick. Other considerations would be Renin 6, Deep Cavern Bat, and Intrepid Adversary if I wanted to just go white. One of the cool tricks about Intrepid Adversary, and one of the neat little design twists, is that when it ATBs, you can pay that cost any number of times, but it's not actually a kicker cost. So you don't pay it when it's cast. It's when it enters the battlefield. There's numerous ways to blink cards in white to have them, get exiled and then re-enter the battlefield. And when they do, it triggers again, and you can, then later on in the game, you can pay to pump it up. Okay. Let's talk green here, Luis. We're going Wooburg here, and that means that we've done all the other colors except for green. I think that a lot of people, when they think of green, they think of mana acceleration, doing big things, maybe being able to blow up permanents like artifacts, enchantments, lands, that type of stuff. Where does green stand overall, against its peers in the Vintage Cube right now?
It's kind of funny. So I actually think green has gone through a bit of a renaissance, and I really like where it's at now compared to where it was, I don't know, maybe a year ago. And to give you a little bit of a history lesson, for the longest time, green's main deck of sorts was green ramp. And we're talking like Raphellos, Wall of Roots, ramping up to Craterhoof, that sort of thing. All the
elves.
Yep, all the elves, all that stuff. And at this point in time, green, and that wasn't working very well. So I think that was a downside for green. It was I think the worst color in the cube. I don't think that anymore about green, and I think that there's a couple of factors that have kind of contributed to that. So where I think green is now, its strength still is an acceleration, but we're not talking accelerating to Primeval Titan anymore. What we're talking about is playing Birds of Paradise, one of the Ignoble or Noble Hierarchs, Avacyn's Pilgrim, whatever, 1 mana creature, and then turn 2 playing like a Sentinel of the Nameless City, the 2 and a green 3/4, or a Broadside Bombardiers or Lelia into an aggressive 3-drop, then an aggressive 4-drop like Questing Beast, Olvenwald Oddity, Minsk and Boo, that sort of thing. And it doesn't have to always be red-green, though I think that's one of the better pairings for it. It can also be blue-green, where you go 1-drop into 3-drop into have a counter up on the next turn. And these are the games where Brazen Borrower, for example, is really good. So as we see green kind of add that to its repertoire, it got a lot stronger, because I think those are very good ways to win games. And then you also have the kind of green, like Channel, Sneak Attack, Vault-Born Tyrant, Worldspine Worm, Flash, like big upside. And there's still a green lands package too. There's like Titania, Ramanop Excavator, Fast Bond, Tireless Tracker. This cube doesn't have it, and I've also cut it. And actually really one of the things that's been cool recently is Chris Wolf, who's managing the cube list for Daybreak now. He and I chat a bunch. We talk a lot about cube. I take stuff from his cubes. He takes stuff from mine. Like we've talked about the cards that worked or doesn't, or where they've landed, because like we don't always even have the same goals. So you see a lot of cards in this cube that are in mine cube right now, and I like that. I've been enjoying this Magic Online cube a lot. And so you end up with the lands package doesn't have Dark Depths or Thespian Stage anymore. Those have kind of faded out just because they weren't quite good enough. But still, Titania, Strip Mine, Ramanop, Fast Bond Tracker, all that stuff works pretty well. And there's also Domain. Domain is kind of still like a subset of what's going on with, the ramp 1s into 3s strategy. But domain is still, it can also be very good. You get rewarded with cards like Territorial Kavu, Leyline Binding. You get the late Leovold that other people can't really play, that sort of thing. So when we talk about these green cards that don't fit into those paradigms are going to be cards I don't think you should be taking very highly and are likely to be rotated out of the cube. But, like, for example, I think like Avacyn's Pilgrim's a lot more what green wants to do than Raphellos. And that would have been kind of an unthinkable thing, like 3 years ago. Yeah.
I have to say, I do kind of miss that strategy. I had kind of moved past it personally. It's kind of the same thing over and over in some ways. It would usually be mono green or occasionally, or like maybe half the time green blue would be a thing. You'd supplement the good green cards with a bunch of good blue cards. But the thing I really did appreciate about it was that it was simple and it was a great way to onboard new players, right? They could know, okay, I'm going to take a bunch of elves. Well, which elves? Just take them. Like, don't worry about it. They're all fine. Yes, there are some that are better than others, but just take the cheaper elves and then try to get the big hitters like you talked about, cards like Raphellos, was a key, like, busted kind of ramp card that you could get, as well as Cradle, and then it was like, and then kind of skip the mid-range stuff. Cards that cost 4 and 5 mana, just don't bother. 6 mana, not really great. 7 mana, now we're starting to talk business, right? It would be cards like Karn, right? Like Karn Liberated, by the way, that Karn, and then, maybe some Eldrazi or something like that. And I really liked that was viable. I wouldn't want it to be the best deck. That's a little too boring or whatever, too straightforward. But I liked that, like, sometimes you had like a decent mid-range style deck or a control deck and somebody played an elf and you're like, uh-oh, like if they go quick here, like they're going to get something down and they can beat me. And I remember when Adam first started drafting Cube, that was a deck that he really gravitated to as somebody who had never drafted Cube ever and didn't know the old cards and all that kind of stuff. And it really was a nice handhold. So I do kind of miss, Elf, Raphellos, Karn curve outs, but it is really weird to see like how much better Questing Beast. Questing Beast to me is the prototypical modern green card now as a payoff, where, we used to make fun of it. It would be like if you think that's what green's supposed to be doing, like you do not understand how Cube works. Like you need to be lower than that and then way higher than that. But you definitely don't want to stop at Questing Beast. It would just slow you down. Cards like Thragtusk and Questing Beast. Whenever somebody played those against me, I was like, you don't get it. Like that is not powerful enough to win you the game on its own. And I'm going to be able, like, you had all the mana you needed, yet this is what you ended up spending it on. You needed something that cost 7 mana. Now, when I see Questing Beast, I'm like, uh-oh, like my life total's plummeting and my opponent's not even aiming for that higher territory. So it is a big sea change. I do view it as a loss on some level because kind of what is the handhold deck for the Cube? I guess it's mono white or something like that now, but I like big splashy stuff. I think a lot of Magic players like to do big splashy stuff and I do miss it. That said, those days are over. Like that is not what we're doing anymore. And we're going to go through every green card now. And we'll talk it through about kind of where you want to aim your green deck and how it actually plays out now, in the current versions of Cube. So let's start with creatures, which, by the way, green does have the most creatures of any color in the Cube. It currently has 41, and blue and black each have 22 on the low end. So we're talking about half as many total creatures, where white and red are in the same ballpark with 34 and 35 respectively. So this is the creature color, and you'll see that here. So out of the 1-drops, we've got Arbor Elf, which, has like maybe a little bit of extra synergy. It's it taps to untap a forest. And so if that forest has something on it that lets you, make extra mana, like Utopia Sprawl or whatever, you can get a little bump out of it. What do you think about Arbor Elf?
So the drawback is that if you played off like a Copperline Gorge, it doesn't add any mana.
Mm-hmm.
That I think is outweighed by the fact that when you're untapping, a land with Utopia Sprawl, or here's a nice combo: Yavimaya, all lands are forests. You can untap like a Gaia's Cradle with it. Like,
okay.
Yeah, you can go hard. Or if you have like a Nissa in play or something. But it's mostly just It's close enough to a Llanowar elf that I wouldn't fault you if you just thought that's what this was.
Right. Next is Birds of Paradise. Good old Bop. Still goat tier.
Oh, Bop is fantastic. Yeah.
Definitely one of the best mana. We'll tell you, we'll power rank the good ones here, but spoiler alert, Birds of Paradise still at or near the top. I mean, this Birds of Paradise, it was printed in alpha and it's still just one of the absolute best. Next is interesting one. It's Delighted Halfling. That's, it's got a couple of extra little bonuses to it, right? Like it gives you an extra toughness. It's a 1/2. It taps for colorless, but you can tap it for any color, but only for legends. But then they can't be countered, which actually comes up, like planeswalkers and other legends all of a sudden become, easier to get down and uncounterable.
Yeah, I think Delighted Halfling is responsible for some pretty big beatings overall. Like you end up in a spot where Delighted Halfling is just, completely just running over a deck with counter spells. Turn 1 Forest Halfling, turn 2 cast Oko.
Yeah,
uncounterable, that sort of thing. And it's just a good accelerant. It sometimes can only produce colorless. Like you will run into awkward spots where it doesn't actually fix your mana, but it also fixes all 5 colors if you're casting legends, of which there's a million of.
Yeah, tons of them, especially given that some of the most powerful cards are legends. Next is Elvish Mystic, which is Llanowar Elves, just a functional reprint of that. And by the way, Llanowar Elves is here as well. So you do get these sort of basic elves, right? Just green 1/1s that add for green. Where are you at on those these days?
They're the weaker ones. Like the multicolor ones are all better. So like Noble, Ignoble Birds, Delighted Halfling, even Avacyn's Pilgrim, I think, is better than Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, and Arbor Elf. But they still do the thing you want to do. And most green decks are going to be pretty happy to have these.
Looks like Avacyn's Pilgrim not in here.
Maybe it's not in this version, but I mean, it's the same thing. Like
it's the same idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I guess I have Avacyn's Pilgrim over Arbor Elf, but I don't think that's like a huge issue.
There's the next 3 cards are not mana producers. One of them is Gold Vein Hydra. This is, again, some of these cards are because they're from the latest set, and I wouldn't necessarily expect them to hang around. This one's the green X00 Vigilance, Trample, Haste, and it ETBs with X+1/+1 counters on it. And when it dies, you get a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to its power. Is this cube playable?
I think it's fine. I don't think it's amazing, but I think it's good. And I've seen games where it's really good. It's very matchup dependent. You play against a white deck and you sink 4 or 5 mana into this, and then they just Skyclave Apparition you, and you're just like, ugh, that was dumb, Yeah. But you
totally
play against red green or like red black, and they don't have like an exile effect, and it's like they're like, wow, if I kill that, you have 7 mana on your next turn, but if I don't kill it, I'm just taking 3 a turn, or I have like a creature and I can't attack you anymore. Like I've played it in like a blue-green deck, played it for X=3, just 4 mana, right? Just talisman into this on turn 3 against a red-black deck that has some attackers, and they're like, I don't really have a good out here. Like I cannot attack you, but your deck's going to just go big. I can just, I can attack into it, and then you can get to just hope you don't have a big thing to play next turn. None of it really works very well.
Yeah. Next is Haywire Might. This is the colorless. It's in green because it has a green activated ability, but it's 1 mana for a 1/1, and when it dies you gain 2 life, and you can pay green and sack it to exile a non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment.
I really like this card. I think it plays out really sweetly. I don't think it's a very high pick. Like you can usually get it back on the wheel, but it's a good card. Like you're very happy to put this card in your deck,
even if you don't have green Luris.
Luris does make it better. Tolarian Academy makes it better. Urza Saga makes it better. Skull Clamp makes it better. All those things are true. But even if you don't have all of those, like I would say if you're just a base green deck, if you don't have any other way to kill artifacts or enchantments, then you should probably main deck this card. Like there's not a good reason not to. It's just there's a lot of targets in cube. It's an efficient card.
Next is one of the better 1 mana threats going. It's Hex Drinker. This is the
love Hex Drinker.
Yeah,
my number 1 pick in the entire cube for I cast 1 spell this game and I won the game. I've seen Hex Drinker solo a lot of people, myself included.
Totally.
It's such a well-designed card look, it's a super powerful card, and obviously sometimes you play against it and you feel like, what the hell, I can't even do anything against this. But I really like that the first category is pro instant, so then you feel pretty good about going for it once it's already leveled up to a 4/4, and then you go, give it pro everything and you kill them in a few turns. It only costs 1 mana, and it has some drawbacks. Like when you go for it and then they have Leyline Binding, which gets around pro instance when the 8th counter is about to go on, like that's a beating. It still gets hit by sweepers. It's not an unbeatable card by any stretch. It's just a very, I think, solid, threatening card, and I'd play it a lot. It's a very good card.
Yeah, really been impressive, and a great mana sink as well. Next is Ignoble Hierarch. This is the Noble Hierarch that taps for Jund colors instead of Bant colors.
I think it might be better than Noble Hierarch right now.
That hurts me.
I mean, it's kind of immaterial in that they're both really good. The same decks always want both. But I think red-green uses this card better than blue-green or blue-white.
Yeah.
Green-black isn't very good, so I guess that's a downside. But I think overall, Ignoble is slightly ahead of Noble, but both very strong.
Yeah, I think that to me is a artifact of the fact that red has become so much better and has such great 3-drops. That, like, if you can go Ignoble Hierarch into red 3-drop, pick your poison there, you can have a major impact on the game. And that didn't used to be the case, where Noble Hierarch was always better because it made blue mana and to a lesser extent white. But, you could use it to power out powerful blue spells, but things have evened out a bit on that front. Llanowar Elves, I mentioned before, so that's the same thing as Elvish Mystic. And then Noble Hierarch, which we just talked about. Last card, I'm like, I don't get it, but it's Sylvan Safekeeper. It's the green 1/1 that you can sack a land to have target creature get Shroud or whatever until end of turn.
I like this more when Dark Depths was in the cube. I thought that was a neat combo, and it's a kind of cool combo with like Titania. It's another way to sack all your lands and get 5/3s. Mm-hmm. I think this one's a little below the curve. I would not include it in my cube. It's not a card you want very often. I think the best use for it in this cube is to take it late, put it in your sideboard, and side it in against like the all removal deck when you're the green mid-range deck.
Okay, we have to pick our goat for the green 1-drops. This is actually tough, right?
It is, but it's kind of like a podium where instead of a first, second, and third, it's a first, because I think Birds of Paradise, Noble Hierarch, and Ignoble Hierarch are essentially the same. Yeah. Like, I would say that Ignoble's the best one of those, but by a small margin. And often in a draft, you'll want you'd rather have birds, right? You're playing Teamer. It's just like, okay, I think I'd rather have the access to blue mana than the Exalted. But on rate, Exalted is a little bit better. So yeah, I would say those. Hex Drinker is like a nice dark horse there, where it adds something very different from the rest. But it's a very big jump between Birds, Noble, Ignoble, Delighted Halfling, and then Elvish Mystic, Llanowar Elves, Arbor Elf, Avacyn's Pilgrim, whichever one of those you include. Right. And I lump Pilgrim in with those because just white mana is not the same as all the domain ones, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and those cards, those 3 cards, that trifecta that you named, play out super, super well in the cube, especially in the modern era where, we are splashing around a lot, and those extra colors go a long way.
I've had domain decks that would first pick a Birds of Paradise, but would not put Elvish Mystic in their deck.
Oh, that really just kind of describes it. All right, 2-drops. First up is Bristly Bill Spinesower. Again, another new card, so who knows if it'll stick around. I have it in right now, and I think it's okay, but barely there. Like, sometimes you open on this with a fetch land, and it feels pretty good. Or late, you're like, play this, play a fetch, have 5 mana up, attack, and then the combat math's pretty tough because now you've got 2 counters, plus you can pay 5 and double them and all that. But overall, I think this card is pretty replacement level. Yeah, that would be my take too, although I haven't actually tried it out just yet. Next is another card that's nice to have with the fetch, is Lotus Cobra. Is this one still holding its own? Is it good enough?
Yeah, it's good enough. It's got some vulnerabilities that the others don't share. Like, you need to have a land drop. Like, this is one of the few accelerants where you play it on turn 2 and then on turn 3 it adds no mana because it's a double whammy. Your mana screwed and it's not, your accelerant's not helping. Yeah. But it also adds any color and sometimes multiple in the same turn. So I like Lotus Cobra. I think it's a fine card.
I do too. Next is Nishoba Brawler. which we talked about in conjunction with our Crack-A-Pack there. This is the star 3 trampler that gets its power equal to your domain.
I like this card for basically all the same reasons as Territorial Kavu, but I think it is a worse card because it's capped out at 5/3 trample instead of 5/5 with a looting effect or a way to eat their graveyard. So it's still a reward for domain, but the fact that it's slightly easier to cast is kind of irrelevant because if you can't cast the Territorial Kavu, probably wasn't going to be that good anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that extra, those triggered abilities on the Territorial Kavu come up way more often than you think. Being able to nab a card out of somebody's graveyard in Vintage Cube is a big deal. Like that blows up a lot of strategies, makes life very difficult for some decks. And then of course, looting is just generally, or in this case, rummaging is just a good thing. Next is Outland Liberator. This is the 1 and a green 2/2, and you can pay 1 and sack it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. But it also has, nighttime, daytime, and it flips over into a 3/3 that whenever it attacks, you can blow up an artifact or enchantment that the defending player controls. You still have that sack ability too. I have not found this to be quite up to snuff. It's fine, but
I think it's okay. Like it's a playable card. Just any sort of disenchant, especially on a stick where you get to like attack with it against opponents that like don't have a target, though that's obviously not like that exciting, is okay. And sometimes you get to play this card and they don't have a play on their turn and things get ugly fast because you now have a 2-mana 3/3 that if they ever play something, you just attack and destroy it. I think this card is right on the like Bristly Bill level, take it or leave it. You should play this card a decent amount. If you have Green Suns in your deck, it's kind of nice to have a way to do something. Whether you like this more than Reclamation Sage, I think they're both pretty close.
Yeah, I like Reclamation Sage better.
I know you do.
Yeah. And next is Paradise Druid.
Paradise Druid is cool. This was an addition.
Slower, but interesting.
Yeah, this was an addition to my cube that Max suggested, and it's been playing out well, where it's invulnerable the turn you play it. So like you play this on turn 2, you're going to get untapped with it, barring a Liliana Sheoldred's Edict sort of effect. Mm-hmm. But then when you use it, and now it becomes vulnerable, which is kind of interesting. Like you get to, there's a little bit of counterplay there. And the domain fixers are decent. It's a lot worse than any 1-mana play. Mm-hmm. But, it's still good enough for cube, and there's still decks that are happy with it.
Next is the old-time goat that we were talking about, Raphellos, Llanowar Emissary. This is GG for a 2/1 that taps to add a green mana for each forest you control. So this is like the highest output, most explosive of the mana accelerators.
Yeah, I think this one is a little bit behind the times, but if you like it, especially for nostalgia's sake, it's fine. And it has some cool new stuff like Yavimaya Raphellos is a pretty nice new little combo. Mm-hmm. Overall, I don't really like how many conditional things are with this. It costs double green to cast. It also then doesn't always tap for a ton of mana. Obviously, if you can cast it, you can usually tap it for at least 2, but sometimes you can only tap it for 1. Mm-hmm. And I would rather ramp guaranteed, like have a 1 and a green cost card that I can more often play on turn 2 that adds other colors like Paradise Druid. Like how many cube decks would rather have Raphellos than Paradise Druid? I think like of decks that would be interested in this kind of card, if you ask them which one they want, it's probably like 7 or 8 to 1 would rather have Paradise Druid. Maybe
now. Yeah. I mean, because again, before mono green was a much more supported archetype, and Raphellos was kind of the king of mono green. And now that's just not the case. There's not really a huge incentive to be just green. Yeah. And so now Paradise Druid and that type of card jump up a lot. Scavenging Ooze.
I don't mind having a couple cards like this. Like once we get to artifacts, Soul Guide Lantern or Relic of Progenitus, White, we already talked about Containment Priest. Like hate cards that aren't embarrassing to put in your main deck, I think are kind of cool. I still haven't come around to wanting to put Pyroblast in my cube. And I think Scavenging Ooze fits nicely. Like it's good against Reanimator. It can be good against like aggressive red decks. In the late game, it could be good against anyone because it's just like a 6/6 that messes with graveyards and gets bigger and gains you life. You can Green Sun Zenith for it. Like it's just an overall fine card. I would say that I probably put it in the main deck of my green decks like 20% of the time, and 80% of the time it's in the sideboard. But I also will pick it on the second lap a lot if I'm playing green because it's really nice to have.
Yeah, I used to run this in the main all the time, and it actually felt like it was really good, but I don't anymore.
It's gotten power crept out a little bit.
Sylvan Caryatid,
even way better than Paradise Druid. It always has hexproof, and it also can even block. Like blocking,
Yeah.
blocking and attacking two power creature like Ragavan, for example, is just so huge. And this adds any color. It's going to survive to your turn almost every time. A very good card. And there are some decks that would rather have Sylvan Caryatid than some of the one drops if they're like very creature light domain decks that have a curves that are on 4 and 5.
Yeah.
Because this doesn't give them a free thing to use Burst Lightning on.
Right. Guess who's back? Tarmogoyf has made its return to the cube.
Yeah,
it's funny why.
It's funny how things rotate, but Tarmogoyf, I think, is actually kind of good enough again with Green's new identity.
Is it really?
It's not by a lot, but I think it is, yeah.
Okay. Like, yeah, because it's looking to beat down more.
Yeah, it's looking to beat down more, and then there's also like kind of green mid-range decks that even if they're not beating down, Tarmogoyf's a very good defensive measure, which I think is cool. Like I think that if you have Tarmogoyf in your like, green, blue, black, like your Sultai deck that is looking to cast counters and discard and stuff, and you have Tarmogoyf that can maybe clock a like control deck, or you play it against those red-green decks and it's like a 3/4. Like you fetch Thoughtseize, then Tarmogoyf, just the classic Jund play, and I think it can work out pretty nicely.
Tough Cookies, our last 2-drop here, which means Wall of Roots isn't in the cube right now.
Correct. Paradise Druid, I think. Well, not even Paradise Druid, more like Rofellos probably cut that out. Is my guess.
I guess they're just trying to go towards the mid-range beatdown deck with like the Bristly Bill stuff, but man, I really like Wall of Roots. Anyway, Tough Cookie also in that same category with Bristly Bill.
Yeah, I actually think I'm going to cut this one, and I think Chris agrees. We've talked about it. The victory case for this is a lot higher than Bristly Bill, which is your blue-green artifacts with like Urza, Tolarian Academy sort of stuff. And I've seen it be really good there. I've had games where I cast this and just animate 3 things and attack. But my kind of intuition, and I make a lot of my cuts based on vibes. I don't have like literal data. I don't have, which I'm also skeptical of because I've seen some of the data they use for the Magic Online Cube. It's not useful. You want to know what the highest win rate like cards in the cube? If you look at like the last one, it's like of the top 50, it's like 48 white cards or something. It's like that doesn't it doesn't really tell me much. Usher of the Fallen is the 7th best winning card or whatever.
I see. Yeah.
A lot more to go into. I'm sure Sirkovitz could probably steer us in the right direction, but I just see that Tough Cookie doesn't get played very often at a rate that's just too low for me. So I'm cutting it from the cube.
I agree. I just feel like I wish there was a world where Green could lean a little bit more into the ramp identity. I get it that it's not going to be the thing we were talking about before, like some Karn payoff for 7 mana, whatever. But like these cards like Tough Cookie and Bristly Bill, they just feel like misplaced white cards to me that are like not really core to what Green's trying to do. Where when I see cards like Paradise Druid and like Sylvan Caryatid and stuff, I like those. Like those cards fit for me a little bit better. This is an interesting one. What's the GOAT of these 2s? Is it the Caryatid?
Yep, I think so.
I think so too.
I think Sylvan Caryatid is just a very versatile, powerful card. And what I really like, its kind of underrated aspect, is that you can play it in a deck with 4 creatures, whereas like a Birds of Paradise would be a lot worse fit there. So
huge liability.
I like Caryatid.
I do too. I think Rofellos, deserves an honorable mention because if built around it is the most broken of these. Like it's definitely if somebody goes forest, Rofellos, like it's definitely the scariest where they can start, deploying huge things quickly, but it's so much more narrow now. Sylvan Caryatid's never broken, right? It's always, but it always does the thing that it's supposed to do, and it does it very well. And in the current cube, that's just better. 3 drops. First up is Augur of Autumn.
I think these cards are not quite good enough. Courser and Augur, I think, are both
sad. See, I want this stuff.
I mean, you can want all you want, but just like the reality of the situation is, I just don't think these cards really cut the mustard anymore.
Yeah. And by the way, the next card is Courser of Crufix. Why? Incremental. The advantage is too small, too incremental.
Yeah, I just think that like these cards are too hard to use and have work. Like you end up in a spot where it's like you need 1 green. Play a card that doesn't affect the board that much. A 2/3 or a 2/4, right? Talking about Courser and Augur at the same time aren't like that big of a threat against control decks, and aggro decks aren't like that worried about it. They can, some are get annoyed by Courser for sure, but overall, and then you have to have your top card to be a land for it to work. But if it is, you get an extra card, sure, and if it's not, you get nothing. It just doesn't really. It doesn't really work that well. I just don't think it's good.
I find that I think that the lands deck has like a fundamental problem, which is just basically that there's really only one copy available in the cube of some of the absolute keys, right? Like your strip mine, there's only one strip mine. Wasteland can do an impression of it occasionally, but strip mine is a win con and something that you can build around that you know will gain you a huge advantage, where Wasteland is like a nice to have that doesn't usually do that. And, fast bond, there's only one fast bond. Exploration's good. It's fine. It does some things, but it is not the same thing as fast bond, right? And like these type of cards, right? If you had access to multiple effects that were similar, to these, like if there was a creature that had the fast bond ability or something like that, these type of Augur of Autumns and Coursers with a bunch of fetches start to do things where you can maybe chain them together, get multiple lands a turn off of the top of the library and really start to kind of do some crazy stuff. But yeah, they just don't quite feel powerful enough. And I'm bummed about it. I really am, because I think that these are some of the more interesting things that you can do in Cube. And I wish there was a little bit more room for incremental strategies like this. I don't want slow decks or bad decks to be good, but this is a place where green gets to do more than Tarmogoyf, Tough Cookie, Bristly Bill. And then, we'll talk about Questing Beast and Oddity and those type of cards that are just kind of like Haumph, right? Just like big, powerful stuff that's going to turn sideways and attack you, which I get it that that's what competes because of the speed of the format. But these are so much more interesting, Augur and Courser and our beloved Oracle, which just isn't even in here. Like that to me is like, when you take that card away, and furthermore, when it's correct to take that card away, to me, you're missing some of the really cool parts about green that other colors don't get.
I got a format for you then.
What is it?
Winston. Winston has a bit more of that.
Oh,
because the decks are less cohesive. Obviously, they're like a little bit worse.
Okay.
And I made a Winston version of my cube, which is took out some of the cards that don't function, like Tendrils of Agony doesn't really function in Winston, and put in cards like Courser and Recurring Nightmare and like more value-oriented Oracle type cards. So,
did you put Oracle Moldiah in it?
Yeah, it's in. So
okay.
There's a little bit more to see there.
I'm sold. Yeah, I'm more bummed that I'm not actually knocking, the fact that it's been taken out. I'm just more bummed that the cube is to the point that those type of cards just can't hang. I don't need them to be the best cards in the cube, but it's really sad that they're not even, on the map.
Right.
Endurance. But
Endurance is great. Way better than most people think. I think Endurance is just a lot more versatile than you think. Because on the one hand, it's like on its face, it's like, okay, this is a force of will against Reanimator decks. But yeah, that is a big part of it, but that's really strong. Like getting effective force of will, which is even better because it also puts the card back into their grave, or shuffles all their graveyard, puts their graveyard on the bottom of their library. Most importantly, meaning if you cast this in response to an animate, their next animate's also dead because they have to get something back into the graveyard.
Right.
Like that's not free,
It's a major setback. Yeah.
And it also, against aggro, it's an instant speed blocker. You play against control and you go end of turn endurance, attack your planeswalker. Like they play a Narset on turn 3 and -6 because you have nothing in play. And then you get to slam that. Like there's just a lot that works really nicely with endurance. And overall, I think it's just a really fantastic card. I basically always main deck this in heavy green.
Yeah, I started main decking it a while ago, and I found the same thing, that like you just always seem to be able to find. I think that there's a fear that you're just going to have to run out a 3/4 for 3 mana and you're going to be kind of underwhelmed by it, but that never happens. Like you always get to do something that affects the board, and the times when you do run it out as a 3/4, it's actually good. Like it eats something or it attacks Planeswalker, like you said. Next, this is a staple. Is it time? It's Eternal Witness. Is it too slow for the cube these days?
No, I think this one has some more runway. Like I think that Eternal Witness has enough synergies to like it's to make it good still, even though it's not a card. It used to be like, oh, great, an Eternal Witness. I'll put this in my deck. Now it's like, okay, why are you playing Eternal Witness? Well, I've got Skull Clamp. I've got Time Walk's the best reason by far. I've got Time Walker, Ancestral. I've got a lot of spells. I've got I'm a Sultai deck that has actual good mana, that has like Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, Memory Lapse, enough of that stuff that you can just go like, okay, yeah, I buy Witness as being pretty good here. There are reasons to play it. It's not an auto include. Like Red Green Beats will almost never play it, for example, or like white, an aggressive white green deck. Well, an white green deck might, because they have Flicker Wisp or Ephemerate or Restoration Angel. Those are all reasons to do that too.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, is this card good? I mean, it's okay. It's lost a lot of luster, I would say.
It just feels very, very slow. Like you said, still has its application, but very, very slow. Next is Huatli, Poet of Unity. And that's a Huatli for the 2 and a green, 2/3, and then you could search up a basic and you can pay 3 white, 3 red, or 3 red, to flip it into Roar of the Fifth People that gets you like the 2 dinosaurs, and that's kind of what it does.
Yeah, I think that this card's been played really well. Like it's been a long time since like a Civic Wayfinder type card was good enough, but Huatli is quite a bit better on a number of levels, and overall, I think Huatli is a card that almost always gets played by someone.
Okay.
3 mana, 2/3 that goes and fixes your mana is awesome. And then the fact that it's also a 5 mana like threat in the same breath is pretty cool.
We talked about Ornery Tumblewag during the Crack-a-Pack. So I think we can just move on to, again, one of my favorites. This is a good example, by the way, of what I was talking about earlier with the lands deck. This is Ramanop Excavator. Lets you play lands from your graveyard. This is, to me, like a really perfectly designed card because it does give redundancy for Crucible of Worlds, which, there was a long time where that was the only card that did that thing. And now we've got a reasonable, duplication of that, but it's in a fragile, but also searchable. And, it just makes a different wrinkle where the Excavator being a creature and being in green, means that not every deck gets it. And like I said, they can kill it with creature removal, so it doesn't get to just have free reign. But also, like I said, you can search it up. You can Green Sun Zenith for it or whatever to go get it. And that one change of having Excavator plus the Crucible means that those type of strategies just become so much more viable than if there's just the one option in it. Either if you don't get it or don't draw it, you don't have anywhere to go with it.
Yeah, I really like the inclusion of Ramanop. I'm not very close to cutting it because of all the things, but it also does need, you need to be playing the cards that work with it. You need to be enabling it. Otherwise, it's just not a good enough card. So Strip Mine, Wasteland, Fast Bond are the kind of cards, and Fetch Lands are the kind of cards you're looking for here.
Yeah. Is the 3-card combo in this cube still with
Zernorb?
Yeah.
Zernorb plus Fast Bond plus either Crucible or Ramanop gives you infinite life, infinite mana. And if you have like a land that sacks to draw a card, infinite cards too.
Yeah, I love that too. Like that type of stuff's just so sweet to have in the cube. Next is Sandstorm Salvager. This is the 2 and a green 1/1. And when it ETBs, you get a 3/3 golem. And you can pay 2 mana and tap the Salvager to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature token you control, and they gain trample until end of turn.
This is a new addition from OTJ that I think is not going to stick around long term. It again has like it's good with a Academy style decks sort of thing, but overall I think this is not quite good enough for Q. I mean, Blades Placer is good enough, but White likes this effect a lot more than this.
I'm just not a huge fan of these like white cards or green cards becoming white cards. The Salvager looks like Splicer, Bristly Bill looks like what's it called? Like, I don't know. These are just kind of not that interesting to me. They're also just ultimately like a bunch of power and toughness. And I think I'd rather have, something a little bit more interesting. Like, that's the next card fits that Sentinel of the Nameless City.
Oh, I love this card. It just is very big. It's got a lot of stats. It gives you value when you attack. It actually does work really well with Academy and Urza because it makes a bunch of artifacts.
Yep.
Map tokens play out really nicely. Like this card is just really good. It's great in your like 1-drop accelerating to 3-drop aggro decks, but it's also good in like blue-green combo control where you get to spend a bunch of mana and get a bunch of lands and mess with your draws. Blocks really well. Like it's just overall a card I've been very much impressed with.
Yeah, same. This would have been one that I would have earmarked for no way in the cube, like just too slow, too kind of dirtily power and toughness on a 3. Like I don't want any of this stuff. But every single time either I or somebody else plays it, I'm like, wow, that's impressive. Like that's actually doing things that matter in this game. And it definitely has earned its spot. Last, but certainly not least for the 3 drops is exactly the type of card that I'm referring to when I say that I love that this is what I like about green and this is what I want more of. And this is what I get sad about if these type of cards start getting outclassed, and it's Tireless Tracker.
I still think this one has legs. Like Tireless Tracker is still a card that I think you can put in your deck and be pretty happy with, but it's not a card that I'm taking like 4th pick very often.
Right.
It's still a card that works really nicely if you've got like, ways to play extra lands, if you've got like, fast bond exploration, some fetch lands, or you can just accelerate it out, make 2 clues, they kill it, and that's fine. Its star has faded a bit, but it's still above the bar.
What's the best of these 3s?
It comes down to 2 for me, which is Endurance and Sentinel. And I think Endurance is probably a little bit better because when Endurance is good, it's like close to a 10 out of 10, whereas Sentinel is on average pretty high still. Like Sentinel is like a 6 or a 7, which is pretty nice. It's this, and sometimes I've seen it even be better. Endurance is like, I had a match last week that I put on YouTube where I lost a match straight up because my opponent had one of these in their deck and I was a Brain Freeze deck. And I just couldn't beat it. Like they just had it in their hand twice when I went to combo them, and I didn't really have a choice. That was about all I could do. Yeah.
Interesting that Endurance has come up that far. Now, this next spot is really important. There's actually only 2 creatures currently at the 4 mana slot, but it's really, really important for the way that we view green and what it can do now. And the first card, as I mentioned before, is the poster child for the whole new green era, which is Questing Beast.
Yeah, Questing Beast is a hell of a card.
Really
I think this card plays out really nicely. I think Questing Beast is truly excellent. You do need to be aggressive. Like this is not a good card in those like blue-green combo decks or what have you. But in red-green, it's amazing. In white-green, like any of the aggressive green colors, this is the kind of card that like you play it, it goes past all their blockers, it hits for a ton of damage. Like it's just really good.
It really is. Instead of outright power, kind of regardless of cost, which is what green was pretty good at before, now it's compact power, right? This is efficiency. Questing Beast gives you so much for your 4 mana. I remember when it came out and everybody was laughing because there's so much text on it. And it's still true. It's just a ridiculous card. As far as rate, it's probably the most pushed card I've seen, ever. Like it just was the card that when it came out, you're just like, this can't be real, that it has all of these things on it. But it turns out that this is a sweet spot in Cube now. The 3 and 4 mana slot is where a lot of games are decided, and a Questing Beast represents a very large threat and oftentimes a very big swing in gameplay, whether it's by taking the, not anymore the initiative, but maybe taking the Monarch from somebody by killing one of their planeswalkers, or just simply taking the lead on a damage race. Questing Beast applies pressure to decks that are trying to even be somewhat quick, because it's pretty trivial in green to have a Questing Beast on the battlefield by turn 3, and it's smashing now, right? And then it allows you to take out planeswalkers while also reducing their life total significantly. Interestingly, the other 4-drop, to me, I just read this as we wanted another Questing Beast, basically. Sure, it does play out a little bit differently. It's Ulvenwald Oddity, but basically it's just like 4 mana, 4 power, haste, and then some type of evasion. In this case, it's trample, so one of the least effective versions of it. But still, this card hits pretty hard too, and then does give you a place to dump a bunch of mana later, which comes up maybe a little more often than you'd think. But still, to me, this is just a poor man's Questing Beast.
Yeah, it's quite a bit worse than Questing Beast. It has some upsides, especially against Caracas. That's like the biggest one. And flipping it can be a real big threat. But it's good in all the decks that are good, that Questing Beast is good, and it's still just not a card that you're going to spend, a lot of early picks on. It's a fine card. It's a good mid-range threat.
Yeah. And, Questing Beast has a good argument for being the best mid-range threat out of the entire cube. And it's certainly the best of these 2. A couple of 5-drops. One of them they're trying out, and the other one I love. The first one is Railway Brawler from OTJ. I have not played with it yet. This to me feels like it's in no man's land.
Yeah, I think it's just okay. Like there are times when this card can be good, but most of the time I don't think it's that impressive.
Yeah, just the 5 mana slot's a little tough for this. Like I think that, there's a lot of times when you could. Let me ask you this. If we compare Railway Brawler to Questing Beast, agnostic of mana cost, which one's better? Like,
I mean, I think Questing Beast still is probably better.
Questing Beast better, and it costs like a full mana less? Like that's just unheard of, right? Like if you're paying an extra mana. Now this last card though, I love this card. This is another, again, right in that meat of what I've been talking about, which is Titania, Protector of Argoth. This is the 5-drop 5/3, and when it ETBs, you can return a land to the battlefield from your graveyard. And then whenever a land you control is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you get a 5/3.
I really like Titania. She spawns like new decks, and so the main combo with Titania is Zuran Orb, where you just go Titania Zuran Orb and then turn all your lands into 5/3s. Mm-hmm. Your opponent usually just dies, and you don't even have to commit to doing it till the end of their turn. So it's not like a Wrath even gets you that badly. But even just if I have like 3 fetches in a deck, or like 2 fetches and a waste or strip, I'm just playing Titania. Because if you have a fetch land in your graveyard when you cast Titania, 5 mana for 2 5/3s plus a land is just a really good deal. It also gives you incidental value on any other fetch lands you have. Like, it's a really cool, strong card that you don't always even use, but it can be really good when you do.
You really can, and Strip Mine and all that's obviously great. Yeah, so Titania is my favorite of those two for sure. Next two are kind of interesting. They're 6 mana creatures. One of them is Generous Ent. And I know we've been a pretty big fan of the red and black versions of these. Where are you at on the green one on the Ent?
I think that all the land cyclers are great. If I had to rank them, it would be Troll number 1 because of the reanimate stuff, followed by Lorien Revealed because it's blue, pitches all to the forces, and is just a really good card to cast. Probably followed by Oliphant because Corpse Dance or Shallow Graving Oliphant is actually really brutal. And it's just when you cast it, it's better than Generous Ent, then Generous Ent, and then Eagles is the last. But I think Eagles is still good enough.
Okay. And then the other is Gruff Triplets.
Gruff Triplets is cool. It's like a worse version of a bunch of cards. It's like worse with flash than most of the really good flash targets. Same with like Sneak or Reanimate, but it does all those things, and it's like fairly castable, and you can Green Suns for it. It's earned a spot in Cube, but is not a card that I think is like amazing.
These are the types of cards I tend to avoid. When I play against them, I'm like, okay, I get it. Like, this is doing a thing. This is really annoying, but I usually want to be lower or higher, than a card like Gruff Trips. To me, this is that same Railway Brawler kind of area where, I'd rather be casting something that costs 1 or 2 mana more, or cheating something into play, or casting something that costs 4 mana instead of a pretty tough 6. Next one, Vaultborn Tyrant. You were saying this one has been a real star.
Yeah, I think Vaultborn Tyrant is really sweet. It ends up working so well with every single thing. If you flash it in, you gain 6 life, you draw 2 cards, and you end up with a 6/6 in play. If you sneak it, you kind of do all that after attacking them for 6. It works with the animates. It's really good with Necromancy because you get the double trigger, and it cares about your other creatures. So I've seen games, BK did this against me. He goes, Eureka, put in Vaultborn Tyrant, put in Bonnie Paul. Vaultborn Tyrant triggered 3 times. And,
wow,
that's just awesome. And it's on the castable side, much like Atrox is castable, better than Griselbrand or Emrakul in that metric. Plus, if you copy it, it's so sick. Like when you go Vaultborn Tyrant and then, Phyrexian Metamorph or Phantasmal Image, it's like they both trigger. It's just a really, really fun card.
Yeah. See, this to me is the beginning of that high end, right? This is the type of things I want to do with my mana, not Gruff Triplets. And then we've got 3 kind of holdouts, particularly Craterhoof Behemoth. This used to be the best payoff for the Elves deck, right? You would be mono green, you would make a bunch of mana, and then cast a Craterhoof with like even just a couple of extra untapped elves around. You can even tap some elves to get it on the battlefield, but you would have enough to get lethal through pretty easily if you could curve into it. But we have noticed, right, that like that isn't the primary strategy anymore. Has Behemoth taken a hit as a result?
Definitely. It's fallen kind of into the same bucket that like Inferno and Grave Titan are kind of getting into, which is like the juice isn't really worth the squeeze on hard casting it anymore. And tutoring it up, it's like Craterhoof, yeah, it can be a great natural order, Eureka, sneak sort of thing, but you have to have a board for that to be the case. Vaultborn Tyrant's just going to be better like 80% of the time. And yes, some games Craterhoof does what no other card can do, but I think that the more common scenario is like, I can put one creature into play. Would I rather it be a lone Craterhoof? Well, obviously not, you know? Right. So I think it's still good to have it in, especially since Natural Order, because of Vaultborn Tyrant, has actually gotten a nice little boost. But I don't think Craterhoof's like the top of the top yet or anymore.
Feels like that to me too. Also, one thing I should have mentioned with the 6s, no Primeval Titan.
Yeah, I think Prime Time is dead and gone.
Time's over. Yeah, and again, that's another. To me, I view that as a loss. Like I know I keep talking about this like green lands based thing, but I found that to be the most interesting thing. Where were we? Craterhoof? Yeah. So next is Woodfall Primus.
I like this one a lot. This one's gotten better. Flash makes this work really nicely. Like there are some cool things you can do with all of these cards, and
definitely,
I think Woodfall Primus is a pretty solid card. I'll spec on just in the hopes of finding something like that.
I do too. It's just interesting to me. You can just do a bunch of cool stuff with it. And the last one's a little more narrow, but also seems to have its home. It's World Spine Worm.
Yeah, World Spine is the same things as Woodfall Primus, basically, where like it works with a lot of the same cards. It can be a very strong card, and you obviously need to have ways to kind of utilize it in order to have it kind of pop off. It's the best card with Flash. Like if any of these things is best in class, then they I think almost always are just going to stay in the cube for the foreseeable future. And World Spine being the best card with Flash makes it not a card I'm interested in removing anytime soon.
Yeah, the only thing I don't like about World Spine is that, yes, it's green in this sense, but it's very rare that you get to 11 mana. And so it's kind of a trick. Like it basically exists just to be cheated into play. Like it could be 70 mana, and it probably
it's like Emrakul in that regard.
Exactly right. It's not like where Woodfall. You do actually sometimes just go, okay, I'm going to cast the Woodfall Primus. Here we go. 3 Planeswalk. Oh, which one's the best of those?
Oh, Vaultborn Tyrant, I believe.
Okay, yeah, we'll put that one in with the 7s and the 8s. I agree.
Yeah,
Planeswalkers. There's 3. Another one that feels like it might still be just kind of hanging on for life. It's the OG himself, Garruk Wildspeaker.
It's impressive that the original Garruk is still there. I wonder how many cards in the cube are being subsidized by their synergy with Time Walk, because I would count this as one of them. Garruk, Eternal Witness, Tamiyo. These are cards that it's like, yeah, if Time Walk wasn't in the cube, these cards would probably be on their way out, but it is really good with those cards and, plausible with others. So I think that Garruk is a card I typically don't play unless I have Time Walk, but really good when you do.
Yeah, a few other combos, Gaia's Cradle and stuff like that. It can make an obscene amount of mana. But still, I this is the type of card that if it were to get cut, I wouldn't be shocked. Next is Nissa Who Shakes the World. Really, really powerful 5 mana spot here. This to me is the type of card that can win the game on its own.
Yeah, I think Nissa is a great thing to accelerate too. What's cool about Nissa is in like a blue-green deck, she enables like some really big plays, but also in like an aggro deck, she can be the top end of your curve because she sends a 3/3 in immediately and then another 3/3 in the next turn while letting you dump your whole hand. So yeah, really cool card. And
I like that one too.
I like it.
Nissa Ascended Animist has impressed me as well. This is a flexible, powerful card, right? Like, +1 make a massive thing, and then -1 destroy an artifact or enchantment. That fits really well with the Vintage Cube.
Yeah, I think that it plays out nicely. It's not like the best card, but it's just a solid card in its class.
Definitely. And also, we should mention that, if you do pay the full 7 mana with the 2 Phyrexian green, like, you can ultimate this thing right away and it does like a massive overrun. And that does end the game sometimes. I've seen a lot of games end by people getting to 7 mana and just being like, Nissa overrun, kill you. So that is not something that you should sleep on either. I've seen all 3 of the modes on this card happen numerous times. What do you think's the best Planeswalker in green right now?
The Nissa Who Shakes the World, okay. I think is overall the best.
In instance, there's only 5, and this isn't really where green lives. Legolas's quick reflexes. Whatever. I mean, right?
It's fine. It's not it's not an exciting card.
I don't think so either. I just combat tricks and cube just feel weird. Even if they do more than that. Nature's Claim.
Nature's Claim is cool. It's not anything special.
I just feel like, these type of cards should just be attached to other things at this point. Like, the idea of using just one card, like a disenchant, even if it is efficient, like, I just feel like I should get a creature with this. Especially in green.
I mean, I think that it's a good sideboard card because of its efficiency, but it's not a card that I'm going to spend like an early pick on or anything like that.
Smuggler's Surprise. They're just trying this one out, right?
I actually like this one in the cube. I've had this one in since OTJ came out. And so it's like, for 6 mana, you get a Through the Breach like effect where end of their turn, you spend 6 mana and you cast it and you just get to put a creature into play, or 2 actually, and then attack with them. And then but you also have the buyout of like, if that's not working out, you spend 3 mana and you get to cast like a divination of sorts.
Okay.
And I think that works out pretty nicely. Like, you get this like kind of the combination of those 2 things is pretty cool. Plus, sometimes it's a combat trick. Like, look, I'm not going to say this card isn't borderline, but it's a neat card for like the Eureka Sneak kind of style decks, and I think that's pretty cool.
Okay, you've convinced me on that. That sounds actually kind of cool. Once Upon a Time, very strong card. Very good. I mean, very good. You could make the argument that Once Upon a Time is not a card that you should have in because it slows games down or whatever, but it doesn't happen that often. When it was standard and everyone had 4, I think that it was a bit much that every game started with those. But I think the way things currently stand, Once Upon a Time works out pretty nicely. Definitely. It's earned its keep for sure. And then, come on, Invigorate.
I don't know what's up with the Invigorate stuff. Like, I've tried some of this, but I don't think it's quite good enough.
I don't think it's quite good enough, and I find it like I already don't like leaning into this sort of green is aggro thing too much, and this is just like a step too far. Once Upon a Time, best of the instance?
Yeah, I would say so by quite a bit. It's just a really strong card. This card's definitely underrated. Like, the amount of times I see people pass this card fairly late just indicates to me that like they don't really understand how good it is to have the ability in your opening hand to just tutor for 5 looking for a land or a creature.
Especially with the level of power of those lands and creatures.
It just makes your Birds of Paradise deck cast a turn 1 Birds of Paradise a decent amount more.
A lot more. It makes your Strip Mine deck find the strip. Like, it really does work. Sorcery. You want to see some powerful sorceries? Green's got them.
Green's got some good ones.
First up is Green Sun's Zenith, which we've actually referenced multiple times here for its ability to be kind of a toolbox type card to go get you what you need. And green usually, in most cases, does provide you with those options.
I think Green Sun Zenith is an important card that you're not really going to take early, but in the right deck where you get to like go for you basically, if you have a 1, a 2, and a 3, I'm usually happy playing it, especially if they're a reasonable impact. Like the 1's going to be an accelerant. The 2 is probably also an accelerant of a different flavor. Sometimes a Territorial Kavu, or like a Daybreak Liberator or whatever, the disenchant guy. And then 3 is like another utility creature, or like a Leobold or Sentinel, which is nice. And then maybe you go a little further up the curve, and sometimes you have like Vaultborn Tyrant in your deck, and a card that you can cast for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, any of those mana for good effects at every kind of point is a card that I like.
Same. And the more toolboxes options I have, the more I like the Green Sun Zenith. Next, GOAT tier, Pest Infestation.
Unbelievable card, really. Like, if you have not played with this card, which at this point, I mean, Cube's been around long enough that I'd imagine most people have at least dabbled with it. This card is just really, really good, and it just gives you such a good rate on all the things that it does.
It really does. This is the type of card that takes advantage of what we talked about earlier with there's almost always a target for it, but you don't even need one. Like, you can just use this as a big mana sink late in the game. It makes life difficult for any type of deck, right? If they're control, if they're aggro, they're not going to want to see you fire off a pest infestation for a bunch. It slows them down, or it's a real clock that they need a sweeper for. And you almost get at least one thing out of it, if not multiple. There are decks where you're going to nab two things with this early in the game and the game's kind of over. Next is Pick Your Poison. You said you really like Pick Your Poison.
Oh, Swords to Plowshares? Yeah. I'm a big fan of the card. I think that it's just so versatile that, like, they go turn on Soul Ring, you go turn on Pick Your Poison. They tap out for a sneak attack, you can snipe it. There's just so many things it hits that I think that overall, like, I mean, I've seen it kill all sorts of big flyers. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do, and I think Pick Your Poison is, especially given the cost, very much worth going for.
Main deckable.
Yeah, you should always main deck this card if you have green. I've splashed for it before too.
Okay.
Like, blue-white control with a couple of fetch lands and like some duels. Just put this card in because it covers your bases.
What about your opponent goes, land mocks go, and you go forest? Do you just Pick Your Poison it right away?
Basically always. It's the same reason I like Prismatic Ending so much. It can just hit that turn one mocks right before it gets out of hand. Okay,
next is Channel.
Channel is an interesting one.
Where is Channel at these days?
It's still pretty good. Channel Evercool still a great combo. There's some like new-ish cards like Coveted Jewel, Relic of Sauron that like are big colorless cards. Portal to Phyrexia, channeling that out is not too bad. And you've got to draft around it. Like, it's kind of hard to make a Channel deck work, but it can be really rewarding if you get there. So I like Channel a lot.
Tough. Yeah, I like it too. I mean, it's still just completely busted at the end of the day. It's 2 mana to make 15 mana, right? So that's just something that no other card lets you do. Next, you mentioned, the train car full of cards that are like, if Time Walk wasn't here, I might not be either. And this is Regrowth.
Yeah, definitely in that list. And I like Regrowth because there's some decks that can like utilize it pretty nicely, but it's not a card that I'm gonna take early in most cases. I mean, if the better, cheaper cards you have, the more important this gets. Or if you're like a very focused combo deck that's built around certain combos, Regrowth can do some nice stuff with that too.
Again, very powerful, these last two, but maybe they've dropped a little bit. Eureka.
I actually think Eureka's gotten a new lease on life.
Is it better
Tyrant. That's such a good combo.
Okay.
And I think that Eureka is not a card that gets played that often, but is pretty good when it does. So I'd overall give Eureka a pass here. Like, I think it's a good card to have in the cube.
Okay, that's a big change. I mean, for me, I would view Eureka almost like as a sideboard card, where if I'm playing against a control deck or a deck that I just don't think can really overly punish me for it, and I'm in the rampy natural order, that type of thing, maybe. But it just feels so bad if you spend 4 mana and a card out of your hand and then your opponent just ends up getting a big advantage off of it. It's just like, how do you live with yourself? Speaking of, natural order is our last green sorcery.
Another card that's gotten a huge boost from Vaultborn Tyrant, and a little bit before that, Atraxa. I think that Natural Order is a legit card again here.
Yeah.
And one worth trying to play.
What do you like as the best? Is it Pest Infestation?
It's Pest Infestation. Like, this card's extremely powerful and extremely splashable. You've probably seen this. I have like blue and red cards, and I see one 4th or 5th pick pack one, and I'm like, oh, cool, this is a good splash, and I take it.
Yep, totally. What do you think second? I'm curious. Is it channeled? Is Pick Your Poison actually that high?
It's kind of close. Like, Channel and Natural Order are both extremely powerful, narrow cards you have to build your deck around, but are cards that you can build your deck around. Pick Your Poison is a card you're going to play every time. So I don't know. It's kind of tricky.
Okay. Well, Pest Infestation is the GOAT there. There is technically one artifact. We probably could have just put it with the creature 4 drops. It's Asika's Chariot.
Yeah. I mean, and Chariot is is a good card. It's a good reward to ramp into for sure.
Yeah, when I think of Asika's Chariot, I just think of thumbs up. That's a good Magic card. It isn't on the level of Questing Beast, but it's really good. There are 6 enchantments. The first one, which it shouldn't be, although it's just because it's alphabetical, is Exploration, but that also leads us into Fast Bond.
Yeah, and obviously Exploration is just a much, much worse Fast Bond.
It is much worse. Yeah, it's worth noting that is not kind of a Fast Bond. It is much worse. Like Fast Bond allows you to do really broken things, and Exploration allows you to get like an advantage.
Yeah, but that being said, Exploration still has its moments, and I think it's still an okay card to put in your deck. I think that they're both important to some cool decks, and I like having them in the cube, even if, Exploration's a lot worse.
I do too. And Fast Bond's so cool. Like it's so sweet with draw 7s. It's so sweet with getting stuff back, strip mines or things from your graveyard. And it has all these neat little interactions that you might not think of until you actually start playing with the card. I wish there was room for another one. I wish there was a creature that was a Fast Bond or something. I mean, I don't want this all over the place, but it does feel a little limited that there's just one card in existence that has this effect. Or if Exploration lets you play 2 additional lands where it was, now you're starting to get into close enough to Fast Bond territory, like that kind of thing. Utopia Sprawl, we mentioned before. How do you line up Utopia Sprawl if you're comparing it to cards like Birds of Paradise or, the creatures?
It's generally worse because it requires a basic requires a forest. Mm-hmm. The reason I mentioned basic is putting it on a non-basic against Wasteland really sucks. And if you ever see that your opponent has a strip mine in their deck, just don't put this card in your deck. Like, side it out, because it's just not worth it. When they strip mine your Utopia Sprawled land, it's like, it just completely game over. So
yeah,
I think that the card is fine in a heavy green deck, but is not a card I don't usually take this card super early. I just think that it's got too many conditions, for me to be super comfortable with it. Though it is clearly a decent card.
It is decent, and the Arbor Elf and the Garrux of the world do help it out a little bit. Now, the last 3 enchantments to me are really indicative of kind of where green's at. So the first one is Oath of Druids. Totally unique card in the cube. Can be completely broken. I know some people really, really like Oath of Druids and will try to build around it, but this is a card that can do it can be the best card in your deck.
I really like Oath of Druids because it's one card slot that puts an entire archetype into play. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's just a really efficient use of card slots. So I'm a big fan of including Oath. It's not the best card, in the sense that I think that it doesn't get played very often, and when it does get played, often those decks are bad. But I've had some really good fun with it, and I think sometimes this card can really, really do what you want it to do, and it's a fun thing to build around.
And then another interesting card, Sylvan Library.
This one is interesting because I think it's okay, but it's gotten a lot worse. Like Sylvan, I think, has gotten... as just the cube has gotten faster, it's a lot harder to justify putting Sylvan Library in your deck or spending life on cards at that rate. So I think Sylvan is fine, but it's not a card I'm as high on as I used to be.
Also, there's there's now enough cards that punish drawing extra cards that Sylvan Library actually gets nabbed by that fairly often.
Yeah, Hullbreacher and Narset and whatnot kind of shut it down, which is kind of annoying.
And then there's a really not interesting card, Ranger Class.
Yeah, this is filler.
It's just so boring.
It's just not going to be in the cube for that much longer,
Yeah. I like Oath of Druids out of those 3. Or excuse me, actually we'll do all 6. I like Fast Bond out of those 6.
Yeah. Fast Bond is clearly the best enchantment, though I think Oath is you can make a legit case for second.
Oath is cool. Yeah. And then there's a couple of lands that they have tagged as green. There's Beseiju Who Endures, which is pretty good. And then Yavimaya as well.
Yeah, these are both good cards. Yavamaya's kind of got some cool combos. Beseiju is just a good card to put in your deck. These are all fine.
And then, it's not listed here, but Gaia's Cradle is kind of the honorary for this as well, as it does make green mana, and it does tend to go in the color that has the most creatures and the one that wants to make the most mana. That's green. To me, it feels like green is a color in flux. It has things that harken back to, I believe, a more interesting iteration of green, the one that cares about lands, looking at the top of the library, incremental advantage through things like, regrowth effects, that type of stuff. And then, yeah, there's some creatures in there too that are just kind of big and do big things, but usually they cost more mana, but when we had like cards like Oracle Moldiah, Primeval Titan, and the Cube, that to me was a really nice sweet spot for green to hit, where it was powerful and it did interesting stuff. But now, the shift does really feel like it's towards aggression and towards getting on the board early and quicker. And so we see sort of weird cards sitting next to each other, right? We've got cards like Augur of Autumn and Courser of Kruphix kind of hanging around still, but then we've got cards like Tough Cookie and Bristly Bill that are clearly trying to do something much, much different than that. And to me, I think it kind of needs to go one direction or the other. And at least in my mind, it's a little sad, because I think if it did go back to the lands and the interesting stuff, it's just not good enough now. I just think it's a step too slow, and there's not quite enough, kind of explosive, abusive stuff there. It's a little more about incremental advantage and that type of thing. And that's not quite quick enough for the modern cube.
Yeah, I think that green would be more fun the cube would be more fun if the green lands, like the depth stage Courser stuff was competitive. Mm-hmm. I think it's just like it's enough of a step behind that I think you're not supposed to have it.
Yeah.
But that's just, if you really wanted it in your cube, you could play it. I just don't really enjoy putting cards in my cube that are not good enough, because they don't get picked or played that often. So they kind of clutter up the packs. And then when people do play it, they just don't work very well. So I feel like I'm kind of trapping people, and I don't like that either.
I agree. I would not put them in. I have two theories about it. One of them is that they should be making the green mythics like the Bristly Bills into cheaper versions of those really powerful cards that we've had in the past, and just see if we can lower the mana cost, if that type of effect all of a sudden is kind of back on the menu. The other thing that I would be really curious about, I don't think I'd be interested in actually doing this, because I think that cube's in a good place and stuff, but I would be really curious to see what a cube would look like if you only used cards that go in, like, I don't know how to describe them other than real packs or from real sets, right? But not cards that have come from
like the supplementary products,
right? Because so many of those are what have pushed the speed and the power level in such a strong direction. And it's not like the cards in the real packs are weak, right? I mean, many of those are very, very strong and have had a major impact on the formats that they're in as well. But so many of the cards that you and I have talked about, having come out in the last, 1 to 3 years or 1 to 5 years or whatever, that have a major impact on the cube have come from those. And I would just be curious if there would be a little more room, because I do view it as a casualty of green that things are just having to go towards just power, toughness, and speed rather than, more interesting things that green can actually bring to the table, and that other colors don't, right? That there is no manipulate the top of my library to get lands and get some advantage off of that in any other color. So if that goes, it's just gone. Like, we just don't get to play that type of thing. And, a way to sum it up would be, like, if a format is so fast or impactful, or needs to be that impactful, that a card like Oracle Moldiah just can't even be in the cube, that's a bummer for me, because that's a powerful card. I mean, that, there was many, many years where that was a totally playable and even good card, even in formats where things went pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, on the plus side, I think Domain is a cool new addition, and I think Definitely. Domain is a very green focused identity, which I think works out pretty nicely.
Agreed.
So I do like that, but yeah, I agree that, like, green, some of the, like, I don't know. I guess I'm less bummed about it. I just feel like some of the old green stuff is, doesn't work as well, but they have new stuff instead. It maybe doesn't quite have like as much something, unique offerings, but I still think green is a pretty viable color, and I think it plays pretty well. I think getting cards like Pick Your Poison every now and, like, green got a really good new spell. That just doesn't happen very often. So sure. I wouldn't mind green getting a couple decent instants or something like that.
I think if I could describe green's arc, of late, it was kind of dumb big mana, but at least it served a role of being like, I'm the dumb big mana deck and I'm not that complicated to draft and play. So it was a little bit of a handhold. And then it went into cute, clever, kind of interesting land, off the top of the library, Primeval Titan, these type of cards that were digging up lands and, ramping you and thinning out your library and all these kind of more subtle things. And now it feels like it's getting back to being a little dumber, but a little more just combat focused rather than big ramp focused. And I think that the last version is my least favorite of those three, but I agree with what you said. If it can't hang, then it doesn't really matter. Like if it's interesting but bad, I don't want it in the cube. It needs to be able to keep up with the other stuff. Okay, let's call it a show there, Luis. We do have we'll do multicolored next, and then there's colorless and lands. So we've got still quite a bit more to go forward, and of course we'll continue to do Vintage Cube. The truth is that Vintage Cube has become a really big part of the limited ecosystem. It just is very, very popular and remains so. You can look at the numbers on Magic Online whenever they put it up. And even though, Arena is ostensibly easier to just fire up and jump into drafts and all that, people still, very much love Vintage Cube and will seek it out. And it also is kind of the natural end game, I think, for a lot of limited players where, when you can start to dive into the depths of the Vintage Cube, it kind of keeps providing, right? We haven't hit that wall where it's like, yeah, Vintage Cube's kind of boring now. It's like, no, it keeps changing, and the depth of it really doesn't know any end. And all you have to do is watch Luis draft the cube if you think you're good at it, and you'll go, oh, okay, I'm not good at this yet, because if you watch Luis draft, it's a whole different level of understanding for the cube. So we will continue to do that. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the show at lrcast.com, including a link to Luis's YouTube channel that we referenced there. He does play primarily Vintage Cube on it. So if you are interested in checking it out, you can watch him play and you can see what the end game looks like for you if you stick with it for a really long time and put in your work. We want to thank our patrons over at patreon.com/limited resources. And we want to thank Ultimate Guard for sponsoring this show as well. That's going to do it for this one. We'll see you next week.
Well, I just want to take some time and let the audience know that we listened to their feedback. The feedback on Paul being on the show was resoundingly positive. And, Paul doesn't know this yet, but we've slated him in for, I would say, probably 2 appearances per set at this point. We didn't ask him. We're going to tell him.
We kind of telling him, yeah.
Yeah. So just so he knows, but I think that Paul's really hit his stride, both in terms of like making awesome videos that people like watching, but also just he's really getting into the weeds of the format. This is the Cheon that I'm used to seeing. This is the Cheon that just knows exactly what's going on and is going to do a great job explaining it to you. So I thought that was like a huge win, and I'm like really stoked to see this kind of development here.
Yeah, I mean, he's ridden your coattails for long enough. It's about time you rode his for a while, right?
Exactly.